The Awakening by Kate Chopin, an Interloper's Review. A quote from the book. That is, he could not see that she was becoming herself, and daily casting aside that fictitious self, which we assume like a garment, with which to appear before the world. When I asked a friend if I could borrow one of her anthologies, she agreed immediately. We have enjoyed a fairly successful book exchange over the years. When she asked which story I wanted to read, and I told her The Awakening, she hesitated. It seemed I was coming close to crossing some boundary, like an acquaintance bringing up a subject that was too intimate to discuss. She recommended some Washington Irving stories in the same book, knowing I like his Christmas stories. I told her I'd read them already, and was looking for a copy of Chopin's novel. She asked if I knew what it was about. She asked how I heard about it. She asked why I wanted to read it. She had never interviewed me this way before, and in retrospect, I think I understand her protective reaction a bit better. The story belonged to her. It belonged to women as part of the heritage of feminist writing. I was trespassing, and she wanted to know my motives and intentions. For many reasons, Kate Chopin's The Awakening is considered to be feminist literature. But once you set aside the mostly outdated taboos of its day, it becomes relatable to anyone who feels their life does not belong to them. Chopin's protagonist has neither control over her environment nor over the urge within her to defy it, and seems doomed to loneliness. It is exactly this kind of story that should be widely read. Though the issues are specific, they are not so alien to someone outside the group that they cannot be understood on some level. And understanding tends to be a useful thing. If a person is first reminded with their own experiences with loneliness and being trapped by circumstance, they are more receptive to hearing another's story of the same. One reading of Chopin is worth more to progress than a dozen combative debates. Reading the novel, I had the feeling that Chopin was pulling for Edna, and considering the many elements which ruled over Chopin's life, outside her control, it's no surprise. Kate Chopin knew loss. She was born in St. Louis in 1850 and was the sole survivor of her parents' 5 children. Her father died in a train accident when Kate was 5, which adds some depth, or at least questions, to her story, The Story of an Hour, in which a woman's husband is thought to have died in a railroad accident. When Kate was 13, both her brother George and grandmother died. After graduating from the St. Louis Academy of the Sacred Heart, she married Oscar Chopin and moved with him to New Orleans, because this is where his family's cotton business was based, and they had 7 children in nearly as many years. Every source I have read says that her husband was very supportive of her, and less oppressive than most, though she certainly recognized that life wasn't even Steven between the sexes. Chopin was very familiar with loss and the impact it had on her life, but the death of her husband must have provided the biggest example. She was left with their family's debt and their children, and soon moved back to St. Louis after 14 years in Louisiana. The thinking must have been that Chopin's mother could help with the children, but she soon died. By the late 1880s, Chopin was writing to earn money. Chopin was published over 100 times in literary magazines and wrote a novel called At Fault before writing The Awakening. I wonder if she knew that writing The Awakening would mean career suicide and offered Edna suicide after trying to do what she wanted in life as prophecy. In her time, the book was called morbid, unhealthy, sordid, and poison. Her publisher backed out of a third collection of short stories. The response damaged her readership, though it mattered little as she seems to have lost any interest in writing aside from a couple short stories. The National Book Award nominee Larzer Ziff said that she was alive when the 20th century began, but she had been struck mute by a society fearful in the face of an uncertain dawn. Kate Chopin was likely entering her best years as a writer when The Awakening was penned, and might have returned to it given a few more years to recover. But she died in 1904, at only 54 years old. In spite of Chopin having left the Catholic Church, she was buried in a Catholic cemetery based on someone's dubious report that she was seen on the steps of the church before she died, and the imaginative assumption that this meant she had been to confession in hopes of being allowed to return to church. Though there are what-ifs, She had an impact greater than most any writer can hope to, after having only written for a decade with publication in mind. While I don't entirely understand the explanation offered by Elizabeth Fox Genovese in an interview, Chopin did not consider herself a feminist or suffragist. Feminist is a term that has about as many definitions as Christian. Regardless of which denomination of feminist Chopin distanced herself from, she is considered a feminist icon today. She focused often on the undiscussed lives of women and didn't mind ruffling feathers. I've only read 2 of her stories so far, but this is her clear focus in both. I'm not sure why the public was outraged over The Awakening after reading the story of an hour. In both, she has women who are oppressed by society, and she shines a light on this without apology. My best guess is that in admitting the existence of women's sexual desire, even if barely doing so, The Awakening made gentlemen's mustaches twirl and exploded Model T radiators across the country. I've mentioned The Awakening as feminist literature, and will argue that it's more than just this. I was perplexed by a new discovery this week. I'm accustomed to seeing the advertisement for movies, Cardinals memorabilia, samurai swords, and sales on women's lingerie when I log onto the internet. In some Orwellian way, they target us with ads that go along with our Google searches. What I've never seen before are advertisements for 10-cent romance novels. Now they're popping up everywhere. Not one ad for a classic book of the month club. The Easton Press isn't trying to get me to buy their Books That Changed the World series. However, after researching Kate Chopin, I'm apparently a prime target for every book with a shirtless man on the cover who suffers from torso alopecia. My aunt sent me a gift card for Barnes & Noble this week, and I'll stop by the romance section with my fingers crossed, hoping Kate Chopin won't be found there. Edna deserves better. The Awakening was so fully about Edna that I don't recall a page where she was absent, and an argument can be made that some of the other characters were thin due to neglect. I had the sense that they weren't the ones Chopin was interested in. It's always tricky deciding with the power of wobbly-kneed intuition when an author is creating something new or writing about themselves with enough changes not to get sued. But my guess is that Chopin was reflecting on her own life when writing Edna. All of the expectations society put on women, with the authority of tradition and religion, were familiar to Chopin. But I think added to this is her own specific life experience. Though every story point throughout The Awakening can't be paralleled in Chopin's life, it's the sense of just being shoved around by factors outside her control that Chopin must have related to perfectly. Edna Pontier is the protagonist. She's a married mother in the 19th century, and she seems unsettled with her role in society's structure early on. The story picks up at about the time that questions she's had brewing for a while begin to surface. Her husband scolds her at one point for not knowing that one of the children is sick. Afterward, she sits and cries, and, quote, an indescribable oppression, which seemed to generate in some unfamiliar part of her consciousness, filled her whole being with a vague anguish, end quote. I heard someone describe Edna as courageous, but I don't know if the adjective is a perfect fit. She's an atheist in a sense, and telling her to just believe isn't going to do the trick, no matter how many songs she sings with her eyes closed. The oppression and anguish came from inside her. It's not a choice she made. She was being pulled rather than doing the pushing. So to me, she's not so much courageous as she is victim of the realization that won't leave her alone, even though everyone else has figured out a way to have peace with ignoring it, if they ever saw it to begin with. Robert is the tall drink of water that catches Edna's eye. I don't think he's too important. If he were removed, then she would have just used the next guy with a butt chin and sparkling smile who happened by to project upon. If I'm honest with myself, it's probably the same way I became confident that Emma Watson would enjoy making love to me all weekend, watching me play Mario Brothers in the intervals, even though we've never met. I'm not saying it wasn't love between them, as love may work best when you never acknowledge who the other person actually is. But he's just a blank page she happened to choose. It was the oppressive feeling inside her that told Edna to find something to write on. This assessment might take some romance out of the story, but it doesn't downgrade Edna's hero status for anyone who wants to admire the character. I've described her as a victim, though it's the same brand of victim I imagine George Washington to be, The best kinds of heroes are those who would rather go home and play rummy with their grandmas, but aren't allowed to by circumstance. When I think of courageous, I think of Superman, and he gets boring after a while. If Edna could have found some comfortable way to live the life she was stuck in, I think she would have. She just couldn't make the fit. Quote, in short, Mrs. Pontier was not a mother woman, end quote. To most everyone else in the story, Edna's awakening was understood about as well as if she'd announced that from now on she'd walk on ceilings rather than floors. They were not necessarily bad people. Mostly, they came across as folks who grew up to fit the world they were born in. This isn't to say that they aren't responsible for themselves, but I don't think they chose their mindsets any more than Edna chose hers. This sort of story is a good reminder to the reader to do their best to take a look at the things they take for granted as right and wrong, and make sure nobody's going to be writing a book about them someday. Mr. Pontier, Edna's husband, is a simply and maybe thinly drawn character who is meant to symbolize an average man of the time. I think Chopin did this on purpose, knowing people's eagerness to distance themselves from a character who comes across as a horse's ass. The first thing people try to do when their favorite pundit, preacher, politician, or any other sort of leader or symbol falls from grace is to find a way to throw their darling overboard to the sharks in order to save the boat. If Chopin had written too much detail into the husband, she surely would have provided some sentence that allowed many to say, "That's not me or my beliefs," before granting themselves permission to dismiss every other sentence in the book. Chopin's focus on Edna was a reflection of the author's attraction to the character, but it wasn't only that. Nearly all the sympathy in the book had to be poured on Edna in order for the audience of the day to accept a drop of it. Chopin is also delicate in criticizing characters. I'd say she was aware that criticism that's too slashing will only make people you're trying to persuade stomp from the room and defiantly spout some microwave dinner reply they memorized years before. In order to persuade, you have to tell people why they're wrong without hurting their feelings. In a couple of cases, she leans into her punches a little too much for the purpose of persuasion and gets off balance. But at other times, she's floating like a butterfly and winking at the camera as she shuffles her feet. An example is in the last line of chapter 8. After other ladies tell Edna she has the best husband in the world, quote, Mrs. Pontier was forced to admit that she knew of none better, end quote. It would take Archie Bunker a week before it occurred to him to drop his cigar and say, now wait a damn minute here. I won't state my guess at the symbolism behind the book's ending, because in this case the interpretation would only distract from the importance of the obvious. Chopin sends her protagonist back into the water, where she first found how strong she could be on her own during a swim early in the book. Theories on the underlying meaning of returning to the source of her inspiration after realizing it had betrayed her by giving her that inspiration, or considering how small she was in the vastness of the water and that maybe the water is really society, or prejudice, or tradition, or tapioca pudding, are fine, but the rub is that she was incompatible with life. She couldn't change the people around her, let alone the world. She couldn't change her own outlook. She was a three-pronged plug, and the world only offered two whole outlets. Edna decides to be alone while she's lonely. She takes off her clothes and surrenders, swimming out until she can't swim anymore. She accepts defeat. The result is an ending that drives home a damning critique of society, but not one that's a clear encouragement to others to champion change. It's a pessimistic ending. Edna is defeated. It might be that this is what Fox Genovese meant by saying that Chopin was not a feminist. Chopin understood the need for change and that women had the potential to thrive in an even playing field in life. But the active ingredient in a feminist has to be their belief that change can be achieved. While I understand in a sense why The Awakening is feminist literature, I also think that the label should come with an asterisk. For the purpose of feminism, The Awakening is an incomplete protein. The book should not be dismissed by feminists, however. To call it a story about a woman who kills herself after a man leaves her reduces it too much and misses the point. Like I said, Robert isn't important. Switch him with an Australian cowdog and change the lustful hand-holding, two-page affair to Edna's hopeless attempt to teach the healer to retrieve. The rest of the meat is still there. It also shouldn't be dismissed as being indecent in its day, but quaint in ours, so who cares? If The Awakening was simply a scandalous story suggesting the presence of a woman's sexual passions, there would be little, if any, relevance today since, according to my neighbor Ronnie, The controversy was settled by scientists who confirmed the existence of the female clitoris in the late 1990s. The sexual elements, thought to be shameful when the book was published, would be lucky to earn a PG-13 if put in a movie today. Unless I got confused by the flowery prose in Chopin's time, which has happened before, I don't think anyone had sex in the story. What's left for the modern reader? Far more than an interesting read for feminists who consider themselves history buffs. Nobody should lose sight of the book's place with regard to feminism, not being too high, but also not too low, nor the insight it provides into how life was for women then. However, I'm a man who used to drive a truck 70 hours a week and watched Rockford File reruns on Saturday nights because those 70 hours didn't earn me enough to go out, and I relate to Edna. For many reasons, The Awakening is considered to be feminist literature. Those who say it's only that are shortchanging Kate Chopin.